Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the International Institute for Strategic Studies on this very sunny day. From this podium over the last several months, you've heard prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers, academics, scholars, members of parliament, and the like. But I think when one's talking about the strategic environment, it really is terribly important to have the perspective of the defense industry. Whenever nowadays defense budgets are talked about, the challenges for defense industry as well as for the procurement of those kinds of armed capabilities that modern governments need to deal with a variety of challenges that they are confronted with is always at the top of the agenda. And we so often hear from, as it were, one side of the aisle of that debate. And when we heard that Wes Bush, the Chief Executive Officer and President of Northrop Grumman, was coming to London, we were really additionally pleased by his acceptance of our invitation to him to speak to the ISS on the changing global security environment challenges for the defense industry. Any defense corporation nowadays has to think like defense ministers and members of the armed forces 15, 20, 25 years ahead. So his perspective on where the defense and security environment is going to is, I think, hugely important. He's been CEO and president of Northrop Grumman since January 2010. He was beforehand the president and COO, so he knows something about budgets as well as having been the CFO of the organization. He was for a long time president of the company's space technology sector and also worked for some period with TRW, ultimately acquired by Northrop Grumman. He is a graduate of that most prestigious engineering organization of the world, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and is also a graduate of the University of California. So we're very grateful for his addressing us today, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. As John said, it's a very, very nice day outside, so hopefully this will be the better use of the time than sitting out in the sunshine. But it is just delightful to be here and very much appreciate everyone coming. So perspective today that I thought would be interesting and perhaps motivate some dialogue, and I hope we have an opportunity for some good questions, is to talk a little bit about our world's changing security environment and its implications on the partnership between industry and government, a partnership that is so fundamental to the way that we actually execute the security arrangements around the globe, and oftentimes a partnership that doesn't get quite, I think, the amount of dialogue and discussion that it merits. And I think it's a good place for the discussion here in this very room, actually, because I believe that meeting the challenges of this changing security environment will also heavily depend on the relationship between the UK and the US. Of course, the so-called special relationship has been an important feature of our collective security environment for many, many years, actually for generations. And I feel that years from now, we may well conclude that our mutual dependence was as important to our security in this century as it was looking back over the last century, especially through the height of the Cold War. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about this new environment, to share some perspectives, and in particular, the effect of its rapid evolution on defense and technology companies like the one that I lead, and what steps we need to take to ensure that we harness those changes to the advantage of our two nations, to their economies and the national security of the free world itself. So I think most of us here would agree that much has changed in the manner in which our nations defend our citizens and our interests. If you turn the clock back now, it's been 2 decades since the Soviet Union fell. Sometimes it's hard to believe it's been 2 decades, but it has, 2 decades since the Soviet Union fell. And with it fell a relatively tidy geopolitical situation. Back then, it was a lot easier to spot the bad guys. Most had armies and navies and air forces, and we all spent a lot of time analyzing them, a lot of time sorting through what they might do and what we needed to do to counter. And it fell to the UK and US defense industries to supply our nation's leaders and our armed services with the capabilities that were necessary to do that. Well, the Soviet Union has disappeared. But even though that has happened, the framework of enduring security needs associated with the Cold War itself has not. We will always need to be able to assure military dominance through power projection, strategic deterrence, global access, and certainly global awareness. But what has changed is the advent of a new body of security requirements that have been added to those more familiar ones. I'm talking about the threats that might collectively be referenced as the global commons. Think of the global commons as those elements of geography, resources, cyberspace, upon which all people depend and to which most people now presume access. Examples of the global commons would include the familiar ocean domains and, of course, outer space, but would also include cyberspace, energy resources, areas under environmental threat, and food and water-rich areas among a world population that grows every year in numbers, in some places grows in desperation, but almost universally grows in technological savvy. Perhaps our nations do not have direct current interest in some of these areas, but I think the elected leaders in both of our countries understand that they nonetheless hold strategic importance. As an example, the U.S. government has determined that climate change is a national security issue. It's clear that the instability caused by such upheavals and disruptions has real strategic implications that must be managed. There are new challenges unknown to the Cold Warriors of years past, and they require new tools and new approaches. In this new age, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier still plays an important role. But the large-scale force structure it represents is no longer enough. Indeed, the changing geostrategic environment is driving the development and application of new technologies and the use of traditionally military technologies in non-military roles. Let me offer a few examples. A decade ago, I don't think anyone would have foreseen requests by allied governments for the services of high-altitude, long-endurance, unmanned reconnaissance aircraft over troubled nuclear reactors, or to monitor weather patterns and climate change, or to monitor earthquake damage and to help find survivors in Haiti. Not to mention the use of other models of UAVs as attack platforms for long-range counter-terrorist operations. Advances in technology have revolutionized unmanned systems, and those systems have, in turn, revolutionized counterinsurgency operations. They've enabled the collection of intelligence for use against insurgents and terrorists in both conventional military and non-military context. And they have given us and our allies access to satellite-style capabilities at air breather prices for uses both military and civil. And as for that aircraft carrier that I mentioned a moment ago, UAVs will eventually increase its capability by orders of magnitude while reducing its operations costs and personnel risks. The need to patrol and defend this global commons was much more limited a generation ago when the world was neatly divided among mere 2 or 3 contending spheres of influence. But today, that geostrategic clarity is no more. The threat is now diffuse, and its equally diffuse challenges must be met. And as Western nations usually solve such needs, many of the solutions will be technological. UAV technology has proven to be important, but it must be complemented with something else, something that in the US we like to call C4ISR. And as you know, C4ISR is a rather ponderous acronym for command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's a broad category of technologies that amounts to situational awareness and the ability to engage in an assured manner utilizing that awareness. The advantage of having such awareness and being able to utilize it effectively is that it obviates the need for large numbers of troops stationed in every conceivable hotspot or area of interest throughout the global commons, be it a battlefield, a power grid, a darkened city street, or a network. And let me stress that C4ISR has proven itself in civil roles as well as military ones. I'll give you a few examples. In January of 2009, a U.S. Airways passenger liner ditched on the Hudson River in New York City. I think we all remember the pictures from that event. It was C4ISR technology that helped ensure the ability of the first responders and the emergency vehicles to arrive on scene and to interact and engage as quickly as they did. 16 months later, again in New York City, a terrorist named Faisal Shahzad parked a bomb-laden car in Times Square. Thankfully, it failed to detonate. And a chain of C4ISR technologies, beginning with surveillance cameras in Times Square, combined with some great detective work, helped law enforcement agents arrest Shahzad minutes before he was boarding a flight to depart the country. And here's another new wrinkle. Shahzad's case, as has so many others before it, reinforces the demise among our adversaries of distinctions between fair game military targets and out-of-bounds civilian targets. Potential adversaries today make no distinction between a traditional kinetic attack on a given nation's navy and a cyber attack on the same nation's domestic power grid or its financial system. And those attacks might be directed by governments of long standing, by stateless terrorist organizations, by crime cartels, or by disgruntled loners. Today, the threat is truly multidimensional. So how did all this come to pass? Well, it is the astonishing speed with which technology is evolving that is the source of both these new capabilities and these new vulnerabilities. And much of the focus of this rapidly evolving security environment, the eye of the storm, if you will, is a key element that they all have in common. It's the computing power and the extraordinary connectivity of modern communications. Computing power is accessible in ways that weapons-grade plutonium, or a tank, or an attack submarine simply are not. And it is fungible, being applicable to any number of uses. It can be applied to the mapping of the human genome, the curing of diseases, or defenses against ballistic missile attack. But it can also be used to track and interfere with a reconnaissance satellite. And it can be used to steal your mother's identity or prevent her access to a bank account, or for that matter, to hack into a Defense Department computing system. Today, computing power can even trump kinetic systems because many of those kinetic systems are largely at the mercy themselves of their own computing power. And combined with modern communications, that computing power, with all its many uses, is accessible to virtually anyone and everyone. And that creates a new set of threats and vulnerabilities that change the global security equation. There was a previous U.S. Defense Secretary who once warned of the possibility of what he called a cyber Pearl Harbor. He imagined the panic that would ensue in the hours after such a surprise attack when an entire population suddenly had no electrical power, no telecommunications, no access to their bank accounts or their health records, and no way to communicate with their extended families. Well, while we can imagine some terrible scenarios, the point is not to create fear about what might occur. Instead, it is to help shape our thinking about our present reality and the actions we must take. The example of cyber vulnerabilities points out the diminishing relevance of such traditional peacekeeping bulwarks as deterrence through scale, national borders, or even treaties. And that leads to a very important conclusion. No member of the community of free, law-abiding nations can possibly afford to go it alone. As it has for generations, technology will remain at the heart of our ability to defend ourselves. And the development and application of those new technologies must represent a broad, concerted effort among nations with common interests and with the intellectual capital and the industrial base to contribute. For this reason, I believe the United Kingdom is integral to the demands of this new security environment and the technologies that are driving it. The UK is home to a superb base of intellectual capital supported by a university system that is second to none. These are matched by world-class manufacturing capabilities, and it is all nourished by government policies supportive of strong trade relations with other nations. And our close, trusted relationship enables the US and the UK to work together in a very unique way. Perhaps no other program better exemplifies the value of our partnership than the F-35. The UK is the only Tier 1 partner on this program, and a large percentage of every aircraft that will be built, including those intended for US use, will be built here in the UK. The company I lead is a major subcontractor on that program, and I can tell you that we look forward to other opportunities to partner here. I believe it's in the interests of any American technology company to promote and cultivate the health of this relationship. And there are a number of things that can be done to support it. The US-UK Defense Trade Cooperation Treaty is a very positive step forward in strengthening bilateral defense cooperation, and it will help reduce the barriers to the exchange of defense goods, services, and information sharing, which will speed up the response to the real operational requirements I've been discussing. Now, the implementation phase of the treaty is particularly important, and we look to the British government to work with the U.S. administration to maintain momentum so that we can use its provisions to the benefit of our UK customers through streamlining of advanced technology transfer procedures. To the credit of President Obama's administration, the U.S. has finally started serious attempts to reform the laws and regulations governing our export control, sometimes called technology transfer. To rely on technological superiority as a strategy, clearly both the UK and the US must maintain those things that truly make us superior. However, with regard to technology transfer, the US has for years made the perfect the enemy of the good. We have been so focused on protecting our technological edge that we have actually done severe and unnecessary damage to our defense industrial base. I'll give you a case in point: satellites. Years ago, we were so concerned about others gaining the force multiplier benefit of satellite communications that we essentially made it impossible for U.S. companies to sell communication satellites to our allies. We somehow thought that we had a corner on the technology, but we were badly mistaken. The very policies that were intended to keep this technology secure for the U.S. actually encouraged others who could not buy it from us to develop it on their own. In fact, many even marketed their products as ITAR-free. America lost valuable export opportunities and was no safer as a result. The DoD is now promoting what is clearly the better policy: building higher walls around fewer things. The primary motive for such a reform makes eminent sense: to better support our allies and actually to codify the technology sharing that occurs every day on the battlefield and in the joint training that we perform. However, I think such reform initiatives should also be promoted for reasons of sustaining the industrial base, both here and in the U.S. By broadening the international market for our high-tech products, proper reforms will translate directly into the preservation and expansion of the high-tech workforces in the U.S. and in the U.K. Any efforts to strengthen our respective industrial bases will keep us safer in the long term, particularly if they lead to even more robust partnerships of the sort that I mentioned earlier between our two countries. Of course, the most advanced and effective technologies are of no use if no one can afford them. And so a concerted effort must be made to protect the affordability of what we produce. In the U.S., much of the threat to specific defense and security programs is now focused on customer exhaustion with cost and schedule performance issues against a backdrop of economic and budget pressures that are as dire as any we have seen in recent memory. And I know that you face a very similar set of challenges here in the UK. Now, we in the defense industry can't fix the economy. We'd like to, but we can't fix the economy. So we must do something about the affordability and the performance in our programs. We have got to aggressively tackle the cost and scheduling issues that encourage the termination or the paring back of so many important defense and security programs. And in the U.S., at least, there is much that can be improved. it does require that government and industry partner to make those changes and to make them successful. Dr. Ashton Carter's Affordability Initiatives in the U.S. are driving many of our efforts, and Bernard Gray's report on UK procurement highlighted many similar issues and opportunities. Now, this is all well and good, but how do we actually make some of these expensive programs more affordable? I believe there are a number of actions beyond the procurement reforms themselves that we need to address together. First, we need to embrace innovation to help address the issues of affordability and schedule performance. We need to devise new ways to support our customers' missions that incorporate true affordability as an absolute requirement. Designing to cost, for example, is a must. And this is not just an issue for industry. It takes the collective determination of industry and its customer to pull this off. Now, oftentimes, innovation is seen as the cost driver. We keep wanting to do more, and it keeps costing more. I think we have to be careful about running away from innovation out of fear that it would be the cost driver. We need to embrace it as part of the solution. The second thing that I would think would make a real difference in our affordability efforts is to better integrate the systems we already have or are already in the works. And it's a particularly attractive option for two countries such as the UK and the US. Again, this is a task that requires real innovation. It's needed on all fronts: technical, business, acquisition, operations, you name it. Doing so could lead to combined solutions for our end users that would give them what they need faster and at lower cost, while justifying less expensive and less risky individual components in our force structures, all the while providing inherent risk mitigation through a layering of capability. It also supports the continuous evolution of our defense systems, which has historically proven to be much more cost-effective and mission-supporting than the Big Bang approach to creating brand new solutions. It is true that the changing global security environment has grown very complex very quickly, with no end in sight to this very rapid evolution. The threat is now against every conceivable target with no distinction between military and civilian. The threat may originate, perhaps anonymously, from peer competitors, their proxies, stateless terror organizations, crime cartels, or even unhappy individuals. But by no means are we powerless. We have at our disposal a tool of incredible power. It is the combination of free-thinking innovation within the nurturing environment of our free market economies. Added to that, we have a strong moral and ethical component in our arsenal, and we should not forget the importance of the alignment of innovation and motivation. And these powers can be magnified through closer and more rationalized partnerships. We can, together, innovate our way to greater efficiencies, reduced redundancies, and greater affordability. Today, the defense industrial bases of our nations, like ours, are global resources that must be managed and nurtured holistically. They can no longer be managed as stovepipe systems that are hermetically sealed off from the efficiencies of better cooperation and from free trade. The obstacles to closer partnerships between our nations are not as formidable as they may sometimes seem. Despite the often quoted phrase that we're two nations divided by a common language, we have so many common interests and so much shared heritage that we are very well placed to overcome the difficulties. But it needs a constant act of will, one which I hope we will continue to undertake together for many years well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those remarks. I think what you had to say about UAVs, about cyber, about the UK-US defense relationship will bear further reading and study, and we hope to be able to put the remarks you've just given to us on our webpage shortly so that wider ISS membership internationally can see them. I think many people here will welcome the strong words you mentioned about the US-UK defense relationship. I think the phrase ITAR free is one that we will all take away from this room. Certainly every IISS product is ITAR free. I don't know whether that's the only way we can expand the sales of them. But your remarks about the Affordability Initiative that our IISS member from the United States, Ash Carter, and another IISS member from the UK, Bernard Gray, spoke about, I think merit some Q&A. Because to many outside of the strategic studies profession, hearing a defense industry professional talk about the importance of affordability amounts to nearly a revolution in defense industry affairs, almost as consequential as the earlier revolution in military affairs that were trumpeted by some and sent the defense industry into all sorts of highways and byways of technological innovation. So you put a lot on our plate. I see Michael Shipster there from Rolls-Royce, and I wonder whether you want to stand up and tell us something about Rolls-Royce's Affordability Initiative. But are you? Yeah, there you go. All right. You can start us off, Michael. No, you're going to pass? All right. Alex Nichol from the...
Yeah, Alex Nichol from the IISS. It does seem that we are going to face quite a reduction in defense spending over the next few years, both in America and in Europe. And I'm just wondering what kind of assumptions you're making about how steep those cuts will be. And then what will be the effects of that on industry? And in particular, do you think that there will then be a shake-up in the defense industry such as we saw in the 1990s?
Yeah, it's always hard to predict exactly where the numbers come out in the budgeting process, and so I wouldn't want to get ahead of the curve and putting specific numbers out there. But I would say that I think most in the defense industries are planning to have a substantial reduction occur in certain areas of the budgeting that will affect all of us across the industry. It will drive very substantial affordability initiatives. You can see most of the companies being pretty public already about the moves that we are taking to take cost out. Some of those moves are what I would describe as the more traditional approaches to cost reductions. We're doing organizational consolidation. We've done that as a company over the last couple of years in preparation for this, so we're removing much of the overhead costs that have come with larger organizations. We as a company are actually in the process of moving our corporate headquarters and downsizing our headquarters as we're moving it. So those are what I would describe as the, if you will, traditional approaches to an affordability environment where we need to reach in and do the right things to take out cost layers. The more important part of it is the innovation that I was describing, because collectively we need to get on with a view that the job still has to be done, but it needs to be done in a different way. And we can't simply take the approaches that we've been using to programs over the last several decades and extend those same approaches into the future and expect to have any success. So that is the innovation that I was describing. We as a company, and we're not alone, I wouldn't suggest that Northrop Grumman is the only enterprise that's thought of this. I see a lot of this work across the industry, are stepping back to say, how do we get the jobs done differently? And what does that mean for how we can bring solutions to our customers? Most of those answers have a strong technology underpinning. And if you think broadly about it, I mentioned UAVs just a moment ago. UAVs are an example in some areas of providing coverage or providing capability at a lower cost than other more traditional methods may have been. I think we're actually seeing some of that same thinking occurring more broadly in the C4ISR dimension. And the point here, I think the very important point in all of it is we need to allow that innovation cycle. We need to promote it, not just allow it. We need to promote that innovation cycle as part of the answer on affordability. As I mentioned in my remarks, there's often a little bit of fear about innovation, that it somehow takes you down a blind path or leads to negative outcomes, and there will be some of that, undoubtedly. But we have to embrace it as a part of the solution.
Lydia Barry, Senior Fellow for Land Forces at the ISS.
Yes.
This has been a theme from a different perspective of Secretary Gates, who's repeatedly expressed a desire for all 4 US armed forces to become more agile and innovative, particularly on the battlefield.
Yes.
And I believe the first time he made an impact on this, he expressed huge frustration with the US Air Forces comparative lack of enthusiasm for rapidly fielding the ISR bit of C4ISR over Iraq and Afghanistan. So from your point of view, what can the armed forces better do to promote this kind of innovation other than writing checks?
I do give Secretary Gates a lot of credit for that. He has himself and through the team that he has put in place been very proactive in pushing the view that the issue to be solved is on the battlefield and that the solutions have to be structured from a battlefield perspective. He often used the phrase early in his tenure that the U.S. was at war, but the Department of Defense, the Pentagon itself, did not feel like it was at war, and drove quite a few changes in that regard. There are institutional challenges that any large structure, any large organization deals with in that change, and it typically goes to the concept of operations. How do you actually field and utilize the capabilities? I would say some success was had in the U.S. early on by designing independent structures that attempted to operate outside the boundaries of the established bureaucracy to get things done. JIATO was an example of that. And there was some reasonable success there. But I would say to the credit of those who lead the services that they recognize that those transient architectures were not going to be sustainable and that they needed to embrace it. You mentioned the Air Force. The Air Force has done a remarkable job, particularly over the last 4 years, I would say, in transforming the way that it's approaching C4ISR. The broad adoption of the unmanned aerial vehicle capability, and not just the adoption, but the rapid insertion of capability and the rapid prototyping that's being done, has substantially changed the framework for C4ISR on the battlefield. It's not perfect. I wouldn't want to suggest that it is. But what we've seen is the organizations themselves recognizing that need for adaptability and embracing some of these things that might historically have taken many years to get through a test program before they found their way onto the battlefield. They're getting there much more quickly, and we're able to iterate the design and the effectiveness of those systems much more effectively. So we need a lot more of that. It's not a suggestion that it's changed completely, but I do see a mindset in the services that recognizes that need for quick turnaround.
Michael Shipster.
Thank you. Michael Shipster, Director International Rolls-Royce. The timeframes of governments are often much shorter than those of major defense corporations who work on a 10, sometimes 15-year innovation and production cycle. Yes. With defense budgets shrinking and the need to amortize those sunk costs, a lot of defense companies, indeed not just in defense, but in civil aerospace also, are looking to other markets, and indeed not just markets, but partnership with other capable industrial powers. I mean, India is maybe a sort of neutrally placed one, but Russia, the French and Russian cooperation is advancing, and even China is benefiting from some of these transfers. Do you see this creating threats for the future? Is this something that governments ought to step into? Is it something that the free market can be relied upon to determine? And how do you see this ending up?
Well, I like the framework that I mentioned in my talk, the notion of building higher walls around fewer things. I think there has been, for a long time, particularly in the U.S., and I give the U.K. Credit for more progressive thinking on this earlier on, but particularly in the U.S., there has been a rule of protecting everything, no matter what it was, protecting everything, to the point that oftentimes you could go into a Radio Shack or an electronics store in Germany, in Japan, and buy something off the shelf that was protected under export control in the U.S. Not that it had been exported, it was just already there. And there really wasn't the thoughtfulness that needed to be applied to what do we really need to protect. That's underway. It's going to take a little while to sort it all out. But I do think we need some very high walls around certain elements of the technology base that are instrumental in the technological superiority equation. But if you count those up, there aren't that many. They are fairly few in number. And it suggests a much broader opportunity for engagement on a technology basis around the globe. That's to the benefit of the US, it's to the benefit of the UK, and it requires a mindset around the notion that technology is a global asset in many respects, and we need to be able to work in a world that not only recognizes that but takes advantage of it. So it is a different mindset. There are risks. There are clearly risks. There will be some things we get wrong in the process, so we need to be thoughtful about that, about how we react when we get something wrong. But we need to take a much more progressive view to technology as a global resource that we can effectively utilize to address our problems.
Christian Lemire.
Thank you. Christian Lemire of the Defence Military Analysis Programme here at IISS. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about Northrop's spin-off of its shipbuilding industry. Firstly, how do you think the creation of Huntington and Ingalls will affect US military shipbuilding and its ability to compete internationally? And secondly, you talked a lot about affordability there, but do you think the creation of a smaller entity with, I think, $1.5 billion of debt as initiation, without the ability to tap into the wider efficiencies of Northrop Grumman, is actually going to be able to improve affordability in what is a rapidly increasing cost basis in the shipbuilding more broadly?
Yeah, let me say a few words about the spinoff. The spinoff was largely driven by a view that the two companies separately could better serve their customers, could better focus their investments, and over the longer term could actually serve their shareholders more effectively. In any corporate structure, you need to constantly assess whether the pieces are better off together or separate. I think that's a reflection of active portfolio management that is reflective of a healthy corporate mindset. In this case, this was not a small business that we separated. And if it had been, then the concerns that you illuminated, I think, would have been very much on deck about distributing a corporate resource over multiple businesses. This was a $6.5 billion annual sales business, very, very large corporation, very substantial corporation in terms of its footprint, its employee base, its capability. So we worked extensively with the U.S. Navy to make sure that, number one, they would be satisfied with the structure that we were putting in place, and secondly, and as importantly, that we would be satisfied. We see the long-term performance of Huntington Ingalls as a direct reflection on Northrop Grumman. So we would not have taken this action if we felt that it would have been in danger in any way or would have jeopardized U.S. shipbuilding. So I'm very confident with the structure that we've established. We have an outstanding management team in place. We have a portfolio of programs at Huntington Ingalls that is absolutely essential to the future of the U.S. Navy and perhaps over time more globally. And I think it's going to be a very successful business.
Before I go to the next question, you mentioned in your remarks the important growing market in UAVs, not least because of the growing potential use for UAVs, including in a variety of civilian contingencies, perhaps contemplated by those who initially invented them. But one of the constraints in the international trade of UAVs is the current understandings underpinning the Missile Technology and Control regime, the MTCR, as it's known by arms control specialists. And from where you sit, which is a particular place, how would you like the debate to be framed on this issue in a way that was fair, as it were, to the legal norms that the originators of the MTCR want to promote and the security consideration they had in mind, but equally took into account some of the innovations in technology that were perhaps not fully contemplated at the time the MTCR was originally negotiated?
I think it merits completely a fresh look, to be honest. It was put in place at a time when there was a great concern, a very legitimate concern about the spread of cruise missile technology, other things that were, from a technological perspective, in what today we would consider the necessary high walls around fewer things. We're in a different time now. We're in a very, very different time. And we need to recognize that what we might think are technologies, I'll go back to my satellite example that I used in my talk, technologies that are somehow unique to ourselves really aren't. And yes, there needs to be a thoughtful approach to making sure that we don't have proliferation of a class of technologies that could be misused. But applying the mindset of the time frame when that regime was put in place to today's technological base, I think is simply a mistake. So I would say it merits a substantial revisit.
And who are the countries, in your view, that need most to be convinced of that in order to get a change, not necessarily in the treaty itself, but in the way in which it's interpreted?
Well, I believe the U.S. is right in the middle of it.
All right. There was someone else to the left here. I know there's Nick. Alex, you can have a second crack, then Nigel. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to this issue of procurement reform
Yes.
because, as you know, many people have sort of taken charge of procurement in the Pentagon over the years and have come in absolutely determined to reform it, to reduce costs and to improve punctuality. And I think the industry probably has each time sort of weighted each set of reforms out, and really they haven't happened. So what is going to change it this time? Why are the new affordability initiatives going to work where previous initiatives haven't?
Yeah. When you think about reform initiatives, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the environment in which they're introduced. And when reform initiatives are introduced in an environment of steep upward spending, in an environment where there is not, if you will, as much motivation to deal with them in a very direct way, they have one outcome. If you have a set of affordability initiatives or a reform structure introduced within an environment that we recognize has a very substantial budget set of pressures, I think it gets a little bit of a different response. It still faces the battle of the bureaucracy, both the bureaucracy within the Pentagon and, quite frankly, the bureaucracies within the defense industrial base, no doubt about it. But in this moment in time, it is tightly connected to the broader environment that we're in. And it's not simply driven from a view that the industrial base is bad. Some of the reform initiatives in the past have been driven from a view of wasteful spending or even fraudulent spending. That's not this motivation. This motivation is, as Dr. Carter likes to say, we have to do more without more. And from a long-term perspective on the sustainability of the defense industrial base, I think it is highly aligned and highly recognized that that is true. We must do this. How we actually do it, we're going to debate a lot. There will be a lot of discussion and engagement around each of the individual points of the initiatives. Not everyone will agree with every single one of them. But the framework is the importance here, and I think requires the industrial base to step up here, to actually be engaged in a very meaningful way. The other thing that I would say is a little bit different this time is that Dr. Carter, along with the broader team in the Department of Defense, has embraced industry in the development of these initiatives. So it wasn't just handed across the table as, all right, we the government have a problem, here, you industry, go fix it. There was a substantial amount of engagement around what would work, what would not work. And one of the things that was clearly on the table at the forefront of the discussion was that this is not a war on industry profitability. Having that clearly on the table was critical in terms of having the industry really engage on it. Now, having that filter down through the system and really work out that way is part of the challenge, but it established a framework for engagement and dialogue that I think gives this set of initiatives an opportunity for success.
Yes, the gentleman now. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Mark Huban from Livingston and Company. With an eye on the very dramatic events in Pakistan yesterday, how realistic is it for the defence industry to realign itself in major and perhaps irreversible ways towards meeting the needs of a very technology-driven war on terrorism, perhaps to some extent at the expense of the more conventional warfare, which, from what you've said, is probably the more expensive option. If you're sending UAVs up or designing UAVs and designing technology which is going to be able to find a person in a place and make a very effective action possible, is it the case that you will find yourselves in a position where you have a choice of pushing towards the very sort of specific sort of pinprick technologies at the expense of being able to put thousands or perhaps millions of boots on the ground with all the technology that requires?
I actually see it a little bit the other way around. I think it's an imperative that the advanced technology capability that to a large extent over the past number of years has been used in the war on terrorism, but I think it's an imperative that we cycle that into what you might call the strategic force structure in a much more integrated way. There's where a lot of the affordability opportunities lie. And I think it is also critically important that that be done in a way that recognizes that to deploy at scale, you have to be able to do that much more effectively also at the micro level. They go together. And so building a structured approach to this and layered approach to it, as I referenced a little bit in my talk, I think turns out to be far more effective both from a cost and affordability perspective, but also from a mission operational perspective. So it is something that goes together in an integrated way, not an either or.
Nigel Instow.
Thank you. Nigel Inkster, Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk. I have two separate but related, I think, just about questions on cyberspace, which you mentioned in your talk. You referred to some of the vulnerabilities of network systems, and at the moment it seems that the focus is very much on trying to secure a basic design which never had security in mind and has been applied in all sorts of ways that were never envisaged by its developers. Do you think this is the right way to go? Do you think that we need to think about developing alternatives to the internet for certain sectors, industry and government, or do we need to go really back to the basics of cybernetics and rethink the fundamental design of the computer? And the second question, as a major corporation, we've read a lot recently about the threat to intellectual property from cyber exploitation operations. How worried are you about this, and how effective do you believe has been the response both of the private sector and government to this threat? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me take the first question on with respect to the fundamental architecture of the systems. The first natural instinct when anything is under attack, whether it's network or a facility, is to go to the building the fortress around it. So that has been a natural instinct with respect to the overall architecture for cyber. And we like to talk about things like, we use the words, the physical words, like a firewall. You know, it's a physical concept of protection. I think we're all beginning to realize that networks are more a biological system, perhaps is a better analogy than they are a physical facility that we need to protect. If you think about the human body, you know, every day if you put a microscope on the human body, there are lots of viruses floating around. Fortunately, not many of them will kill you at any point in time, but the body has learned to deal with lots of intrusions all at one time and to put its priorities on how to deal with it. We're slowly migrating that direction with networking and with cybersecurity, recognizing that it is more of a biological system, that we are going to have a constant influx. And if you look at the networks of any large organization, whether it's a government organization or a business, it is constantly inundated with external attack on it. I think we're simply going to have to figure out how to live with much of it, understand what we've got, so there's a situational awareness piece of this, and then prioritize our response to it. And I think that will end up being a bit more of an effective approach from an overall architecture standpoint. There is so much legacy, installed infrastructure, that we're naturally tempted, everyone's tempted to say, well, let's start over, let's get it right this time on the design of computers, recognizing they're a threat as well as a capability. But I don't see that within the next decade or decade and a half as being a realistic defense. And so I think we need to recognize what we have and deal with it from an architectural approach in that direction. So, it's a little bit of a theoretical response, but I think that's the practical approach that we're going to face. With respect to the question on intellectual property, it is a big issue. It is something that I think is poorly understood, quite frankly, the magnitude of the vulnerabilities in the networks and the magnitude of intellectual property transference. I think it's something that companies are becoming more and more aware of, particularly from a risk management perspective. You know, it's not just about protecting the asset, but it's also about managing your risk, whether it's competitive risk or even financial risk. And so there's a growing profile of concern. Quite frankly, if you look outside the defense industrial base or some other institutions that have had a little bit more history of this, like some financial institutions, most companies don't really know what to do and are typically awaiting some view of here's what needs to be done from government. So it's not typical that businesses are asking for a regulatory environment to be introduced. It's atypical. It can be a little bit concerning from a business perspective, but I think a lot of businesses are actually awaiting that sort of turn in the thinking to create some framework for what makes sense for them to invest. Because this will be a substantial investment across the business landscape. And very few businesses want to invest 2, 3, 4, or 5 times to get it right. So I think we're going to be seeing a little bit more call for a broader view from a government perspective on what makes sense to do here.
Gentleman in the aisle there, yes, sir?
Yeah, hi, Robert Wall with Aviation Week. I wanted to draw you out a bit on the export reform issue, and specifically in the domain of unmanned aircraft. Give us some examples, if you could. What do you think still needs protecting within the high walls, perhaps because it provides that competitive edge, and what at this point can be cut loose?
Yeah, I think, let me answer the what can be cut loose part of it. I wouldn't go too far into what needs to be protected because I would start unprotecting it. But in terms of what can be, I think, more broadly utilized, simply the structure of autonomous operations of an air vehicle. I mean, today, that sounds simple, but today, simply having that to be exported is not on the table. It requires a waiver. It requires an enormous amount of engagement. So the idea that an air vehicle could be built and that it can be flown either remotely or autonomously is, quite frankly, a technology that is fairly widely understood. And while we may think that putting barriers up around its export might slow others down from capturing that, if we think about its use on the battlefield with our allies today, both the U.S. and U.K. allies, it's there. It's operating every single day. And to be precluding the export of that technology to those who are interacting with it on an ongoing basis is not very thoughtful from my perspective. So I would start with the airframe and the autonomous operation systems. Beyond that, you can debate about sensors and protective technologies and all the other elements that might go into making an airframe more effective and its mission utilization. But I think we ought to start with the airframe and the autonomous capability.
Desmond Byrne?
Thanks very much. Desmond Byrne, I'm IISS member. I just wanted to come back to your no doubt heartwarming and welcome view of the opportunities for the UK and the US to work together. And your comments also about ITAR and the restrictions that has brought. Also thinking about the marketplace, yes. And the fact is that the US market is big enough to sustain an industry, but if you look at the UK by itself, it certainly isn't big enough to sustain an industry. Now, bringing that together, I mean, it seems to me that there are two things that have happened here in the UK. One is concern about ITAR, and that was manifested in various ways during the acquisition process of JSF, and the restrictions on what could be done here, and the availability of the, as it were, the operational sovereignty of a weapon system here in the UK. The other is exportability of things that are done here. And the consequence of those kinds of considerations has actually taken the UK in the direction, it seems to me, of thinking more about Europe, not exclusively, but more about Europe and collaboration with Europe, especially collaboration with France, in a way that actually was not conceived of certainly 5-10 years ago. So, you have, both in missiles and UAVs, serious propositions of doing things with the French to the exclusion of the Americans. I mean, how does that fit with your idea of a sort of British, American, we need to be in this, doing this together?
I think you're making my point. That to the extent that we're failing to do that, it's causing other relationships. And I would not want to cast a negative view on the British-French relationship. I think that's a very positive thing. And I think it has the opportunity to create a broader network of capabilities amongst aligned nations that will serve us all very well. But to your point, that the ITAR restrictions have encouraged other behaviors that might have turned out differently had not those, in many cases, unnecessary restrictions been in place. So I think we need to learn from the history. I pointed out the history on the satellites for a reason. I think it's pretty generally well accepted that the policy that we put in place in the U.S. really didn't have the outcome we thought it might. In fact, it was very detrimental to the U.S. industrial base. And you might call that an unintended consequence, but it is important that we learn from history and even from current events, as you point out as well. I do think that the administration is taking this on, both appropriately and aggressively, to recognize the realities of the environment that we have today, to make the right steps. But we're all going to have to keep pushing to make sure that it ends up in the right place on this.
Well, Wes Bush, thank you very much for your remarks and your answers to questions today. I think the way in which you delivered your remarks, and particularly the way in which you answered these questions, explained very easily to all of us here why it was that relatively early, apparently, in your career, you were the president of a major defense company. The speech was thoughtful. It promoted an awful lot of interesting ideas here. We at the ISS are very interested in the relationship between the activities of defense industry and the changing strategic landscape and how these two interact with each other. We look carefully at the legal regimes that govern defense industry procurement, but also the political relationships, ever-changing, that affect the possibilities of the kinds of technology sharing and transfers that are increasingly becoming more important for defense industry to succeed in any kind of export policy, as I think we saw recently in the case of India. So the ISS looks forward to exchanging views with Northrop Grumman, as we do with other members of defense industry. You've honored us by coming here today. We hope it's not the last time, and we look forward to receiving you again on one of your future visits. Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you.